The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Children's Hospital had a particular cruelty to them. They buzzed faintly, a sound that Arthur Pendleton had come to associate with dread, with the smell of antiseptic and the soft, labored breathing of his daughter, Lily, who lay in the bed nearest the window and watched the pigeons on the ledge as though they were the most fascinating thing in the world. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes. That was the first thing Arthur had noticed when Lily was born, that deep, sea-glass green, shot through with flecks of gold, the kind of eyes that made strangers stop and stare. Chloe's eyes. And now those eyes tracked a fat, gray pigeon waddling along the window ledge, and Lily smiled, and Arthur felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with terror. "Dad," Lily said, her voice thin but steady, "that one has a broken foot." Arthur looked. The pigeon was indeed listing slightly to one side. One gnarled claw curled uselessly beneath it. "Looks like it," he said. "But it still flies," Lily said. She turned those sea-glass eyes on him. "That's good, right? It still flies even though it's broken." He reached over and tucked a strand of her pale blonde hair behind her ear. Also Chloe's hair, fine as corn silk, perpetually escaping whatever he tried to do with it. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "That's good." He stayed until the nurse came to check her vitals at 4 in the afternoon. He stayed while Dr. Harmon reviewed Lily's most recent blood work, his expression measured and careful in the way that doctors learned to cultivate when the news was neither good nor catastrophic, but simply suspended in that terrible middle space of not yet. Lily had been diagnosed with Fanconi anemia 14 months ago, a rare disease of the bone marrow that attacked her body's ability to produce healthy blood cells. The standard treatments had bought them time, but time was running out, and the only therapy with a genuine chance of putting her into long-term remission was a targeted gene therapy called Heliogen, a drug so new, so specialized, that it wasn't covered by any insurance plan Arthur could afford. The out-of-pocket cost was $340,000. He was 35 years old, a formerly talented financial analyst who had burned through his savings, refinanced twice on the small apartment in Millhaven's east side, and sold everything of value he owned. He was down to a battered watch, a few dress shirts that were starting to fray at the cuffs, and the worn leather wallet in his jacket pocket that contained $43 in cash, his expired gym membership card, and a photograph of his wife. He kissed Lily on the forehead when visiting hours ended. "Love you to the moon," he said. "And back," she finished, without looking up from her book. Then, softer, "Love you too, Dad." He walked out of the hospital into the gray October afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment, watching his own breath mist in the cold air. Tomorrow morning, he had to be at the Millhaven Superior Courthouse at 9 a.m. for sentencing. He had already pled guilty. His attorney, a young man named Gabe Torres who had taken his case pro bono and had done his earnest best, had told him that the sentencing judge was Victoria Sterling, and the look on Gabe's face when he said the name told Arthur everything he needed to know. "She's fair," Gabe had said carefully, "but she's tough. She has a reputation for maximum penalties on financial crimes. She thinks white-collar criminals are cowards." Arthur had nodded. He didn't argue. He wasn't sure he disagreed. What he had done was simple and terrible. 8 months ago, when Lily's condition worsened and the cost of Heliogen loomed like a wall in front of him, he had been working as a senior analyst at Vance Capital Group, a mid-sized investment firm run by Richard Vance, a man who wore his wealth the way some men wore cologne, excessively, and in a way that made everyone around him vaguely nauseous. Richard was clever and ruthless and had, over the course of 5 years, come to value Arthur's ability to find patterns in financial data that other analysts missed entirely. He had also noticed, over the course of those 5 years, exactly how much Arthur loved his daughter. The call had come on a Tuesday. Richard had summoned Arthur to his corner office, all floor-to-ceiling glass and leather furniture, and laid out the situation with the blunt efficiency of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He needed certain client funds temporarily rerouted through an internal account to obscure a series of transactions that didn't bear close scrutiny. It would be undetected. It would be reversed within 60 days. And in exchange, Richard would personally ensure that a charitable foundation he controlled would provide a medical grant, $350,000, more than enough, to cover Lily's treatment. "And if I say no?" Arthur had asked. Richard had smiled. then I suppose little Lily's condition will continue to be very, very expensive. It hadn't been a hard decision. That was the most shameful part. Arthur had made it in the space of about 4 seconds, standing in Richard's office looking out at the city spread below them, and he had thought, there is nothing I won't do. He had done what Richard asked. And then Richard, having used Arthur's hands to do his dirty work, had reported the irregularity himself, anonymously, to the financial regulator, and watched as Arthur was arrested, charged, and brought before the courts. The charitable grant never materialized. Lily remained in her hospital bed, and Richard Vance sat in his glass tower, untouched and unworried, waiting for the whole untidy business to be resolved. Arthur understood, now, what he had walked into. He had been a tool, wielded and discarded. He had no illusions about the trial that awaited him. He had no illusions about much of anything, anymore. He went home to his apartment, 2 rooms, a bathroom with a leaking tap, and a wall covered in Lily's drawings, and he ate half a can of soup and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, holding his wallet, looking at the photograph inside it. Chloe had been 24 when he met her. She had been sitting on the steps of the public library on a rainy afternoon, reading a battered copy of Great Expectations with the focused intensity of someone who had nowhere else she needed to be. He had asked if the seat beside her was taken. She had looked up, and those green eyes had stopped him absolutely cold. They had married 18 months later. They had had Lily. And then, 3 years ago, Chloe had developed a pulmonary embolism, sudden, catastrophic, the kind that doesn't give you time to say goodbye. And she had died in the same hospital where Lily now fought her own quiet battle. And Arthur had been left with an 18-month-old daughter and the certain knowledge that the best part of his life had passed. He looked at Chloe's photograph now. She was laughing. He had caught her mid-laugh, the way he always preferred to photograph her, because her laugh was the thing about her that he couldn't quite hold in his memory the rest of the time. He needed the picture to remind him. She had never talked much about her family. He knew there had been a rupture years before they met. Something about her parents, about pressure and control and a life she had refused to live. She never volunteered the details, and he had loved her enough not to push. The only thing she had ever said, in a quiet moment late one night, was, I had a sister once. I hope she's all right. He didn't know the sister's name. He hadn't pressed. And now Chloe was gone, and the sister, wherever she was, would never know that the woman she had lost had been happy, that she had been loved, that she had left behind a little girl with sea-glass eyes and her grandmother's fine, pale hair. Arthur put the photograph back in his wallet. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the city outside his window, and eventually something that was almost sleep found him. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would find out how long he was going to be away from his daughter. Millhaven Superior Courthouse was a building designed to make people feel small. Its granite columns rose 40 feet above the pavement. Its entrance hall was floored in white marble that sent every footstep ringing back to you in echo. The ceilings were coffered and high, the wood paneling dark with age and polished to a deep, cold gleam. It smelled of paper and authority and the quiet, accumulated weight of 1,000 prior judgments. Courtroom 3 was the largest in the building, and it was full. Not because Arthur Pendleton's case was particularly notable. It wasn't. Financial misconduct cases rarely drew crowds. But Judge Victoria Sterling's courtroom was always full, because her courtroom was, in Millhaven legal circles, something of a performance. She was 42 years old, a graduate of Harvard Law, the daughter of the Sterling family of New Haven. Old money, old name, old connections, and she had spent the last 12 years building a reputation so formidable that junior attorneys from every firm in the city used her as a cautionary reference point. You do not want to appear before Sterling with a weak case. You did not want to appear before Sterling with a sloppy argument, a missing exhibit, a poorly cited precedent, or a client who looked even marginally unsympathetic. She was already seated at the bench when Arthur was brought in, and the first thing he registered about her was not her severity, though she was severe, but her stillness. She sat with the absolute, composed motionlessness of someone who had long ago decided that every unnecessary movement was a concession. Her dark hair was pulled back without a single strand out of place. Her black robes were immaculate. Her hands rested on the bench before her, perfectly still, as she reviewed her notes without the slightest acknowledgement that the room was filling up around her. She was, Arthur thought, the most contained person he had ever seen. Richard Vance was in the gallery. Arthur saw him as he was led to the defendant's table, sitting in the second row, gray-suited and composed, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He caught Arthur's eye and gave a small nod. Courteous. Satisfied. The nod of a man watching a chess piece he had sacrificed perform its final, expected function. Arthur looked away. He sat down beside Gabe, who leaned close and murmured, "How are you holding up?" "Fine," Arthur said. It was not entirely true. The bailiff called the court to order, and Victoria Sterling looked up from her notes, and the room quieted with a speed that suggested genuine fear. The proceedings were brisk and without ceremony. Gabe presented mitigating factors: Arthur's clean prior record, his status as sole caregiver to a critically ill child, the evidence that he had acted under duress. Victoria listened with the expression of someone hearing an argument they have heard many times before and finding it no more compelling than they had the previous times. She asked two pointed questions about the amount of funds involved. She made a note. She removed her reading glasses. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, and her voice was exactly what Arthur had expected, low, precise, and absolutely without warmth. "You held a position of significant financial trust. You abused that trust for personal gain. The law does not create exceptions for personal circumstance." She reached for her gavel. It was at this moment that the court bailiff, a stocky, unsmiling man named Officer Briggs, moved to secure Arthur's personal effects. Standard procedure before formal sentencing. He reached into Arthur's jacket pocket and extracted the wallet, the keys, the phone, and as he turned to place them in the evidence tray, the wallet slipped from his grip. It hit the floor with a flat, leathery smack. The wallet lay open. The photograph had worked its way partially loose, the way it always did, because the wallet was old and the plastic sleeve was cracked, and it lay exposed on the polished courtroom floor. A woman's face, laughing, caught in a moment of unguarded joy. The photograph was slightly overexposed, the way personal photographs from 8 years ago often were, slightly too bright, the colors slightly faded with time. Victoria Sterling's eyes, which had been tracking the bailiff's movements in the routine way that judges observe their courtrooms, moved to the floor. The gavel, which had been rising, stopped. The room noticed, the way rooms notice when something changes in a person of authority. It was a small thing, a pause, a cessation of movement, and yet it was utterly conspicuous because it was utterly unlike her. People shifted in their seats. Gabe looked up. The court reporter's fingers stilled on her keyboard. Victoria Sterling stared at the photograph on the floor. She stared at it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then the color left her face entirely, not gradually, but all at once, like a light switched off. Her lips parted. The hand that held the gavel began, almost imperceptibly, to shake. "Your Honor." The court clerk, a thin woman named Margaret, spoke carefully from her desk. "Is everything?" The gavel fell from Victoria's hand. It struck the mahogany bench with a sound like a gunshot, a sharp, ringing crack that bounced off the marble floors and the high ceiling and seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading. The entire courtroom flinched, and then the sound died, and the silence that replaced it was of a quality that Arthur had never experienced in a public space. Absolute, airless, stunned. Victoria Sterling had buried her face in her hands. She was not crying noisily. There were no sobs, no sounds. Her shoulders were shaking, and her hands, those perfectly still, controlled hands, were pressed against her face, and the professional mask that she had spent 20 years constructing was simply gone. It had not cracked or slipped or crumbled gracefully. It had been knocked away like a piece of cardboard in a strong wind, and what was underneath was the face of a woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. Margaret rose from her desk. She leaned toward the bench. "Your Honor," she said, very quietly. Victoria lowered her hands. Her eyes were red. Her jaw was set with the fierce, furious control of someone fighting to reassemble themselves in public and not entirely winning. She reached down and picked up the photograph from the floor, and she held it for a moment, and then she set it on the bench in front of her. "Court is in recess," she said. Her voice was almost her own. 1 hour. She stood. She walked through the door behind the bench. She did not look at anyone. The courtroom erupted behind her in a wave of bewildered murmuring. Gabe stared at Arthur. Arthur stared at the empty bench. In the gallery, Richard Vance had lost his smile for the first time. Arthur looked at the floor where the photograph had been. He looked at the closed door through which the judge had disappeared. He had no idea what had just happened. The bailiff came for Arthur 20 minutes later, not to return him to the holding area, but to escort him, alone, without his attorney, to the judge's chambers at the end of the corridor behind the bench. Gabe had protested, citing procedure, and Briggs had told him, without expression, that the judge had made a specific request. Gabe had looked at Arthur with wide eyes. Arthur had nodded and followed the bailiff down the hallway. The chambers were different from the courtroom. They were the same building, the same old wood and institutional gravity, but here there were books, floor-to-ceiling shelves of them, law texts and case files, and, Arthur noticed, tucked among the legal volumes, a small collection of novels. There was a desk, large but cluttered, covered in organized stacks of paper. There was a window overlooking a courtyard where a single oak tree was losing its leaves in the October wind. Victoria Sterling was standing at the window when Arthur was shown in. She had removed her judicial robes. She was wearing a dark gray suit underneath, tailored, impeccable, but she looked, somehow, smaller without the robes. She was holding a glass of water, not drinking it, just holding it. When she heard the door, she turned, and Arthur saw that her eyes were still red at the rims, though her face had been reconstructed into something approaching its usual composure. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she held up the photograph. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of something held tightly in check. Arthur felt a peculiar, weightless disorientation. "That's my wife," he said. Chloe Pendleton. She passed away 3 years ago." Something moved across Victoria's face. It was not quite pain. It was closer to the expression of someone being told the thing they already knew, and having it confirmed in a way that removed the last possibility of doubt. "Her name before she was married," Victoria said. Not a question. Arthur was quiet for a moment. "She didn't tell me much about her family," he said. "But her last name, when I met her, was Sterling." Victoria set the glass down on the windowsill. She stood very still, and in the silence Arthur heard the dry whisper of leaves against the window glass. "Chloe was my sister," Victoria said. Arthur sat down. He had not been invited to sit, but his legs simply made the decision on his behalf, and he sat in the chair across from her desk, and the two of them looked at each other in the pale October light. "She was 12 years younger than me," Victoria continued. She was the good one, the warm one. A brief, barely there fracture in her voice, sealed over almost immediately. "Our parents had a certain kind of life planned for her, an arranged engagement, a family alliance, old money reinforcing old money. Chloe refused. She was 20, and she was brave in the way that 20-year-olds are brave, without fully understanding what it costs, and she walked out of our family home one morning and didn't come back. She never said," Arthur began. "She wouldn't have," Victoria said. "She cut all ties. Completely. She was protecting herself, I think. Or maybe she was protecting whoever she was going to become." Her jaw tightened. "I should have gone after her. I knew where she was, the first year. I'd hired someone to find her, to make sure she was safe. Then she moved, and I lost track, and then the years," she stopped. "Started again. I told myself she was fine. I told myself she'd reach out when she was ready. I was angry, too, I suppose, and proud. And then too much time had passed, and I didn't know how to." She stopped speaking. She looked at the photograph in her hand. "Tell me about her," she said. "Please." And so Arthur did. He told her about the library steps in the rain, and the battered copy of Great Expectations, and the way Chloe had looked at him on their first date, at a diner, over coffee and eggs, because neither of them had had money for anything better, with the expression of someone quietly deciding something important. He told her about the small apartment where they had lived and the early days of their marriage, and the way Chloe had cried when she held Lily for the first time. Not the exhausted, relieved tears of a new mother, but something deeper, as though she were marveling at the fact that she had made something so wholly good. He told her that Chloe had been happy. He made sure of that. He made sure Victoria understood that. Whatever had been lost between them, Chloe had found her way to a life that was genuinely, wholly hers. When he finished, Victoria was looking out the window. "She died 3 years ago," she said. "Pulmonary embolism. It was very fast." He paused. "She didn't suffer. She was 31. Yes. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people sitting in the presence of a grief that is too large to manage and simply letting it exist. Then Victoria turned from the window, and something had shifted in her face. The calculation, the distant judicial appraisal that she had trained over the years into a permanent feature, was momentarily absent. What remained was simpler and harder to look at. You said she left a child, Victoria said. Lily. Lily is 7. She has her mother's eyes. Arthur's voice was even. She has Fanconi anemia. She's in St. Catherine's Children's Hospital, and the only treatment that can help her costs more money than I am able to earn in the next several years. He looked at his hands. I made a terrible decision. I know that. I want you to know that I know that. Victoria studied him with those sharp, reddened eyes. And the man who pressured you into making it, she said slowly, is currently sitting in my courtroom. Arthur said nothing. Victoria picked up the gavel. She had brought it from the courtroom. Arthur realized now, placed it on her desk, and she turned it over once in her hands, thoughtfully. Mr. Pendleton, she said, I am going to need you to tell me everything. The next morning, Victoria Sterling did something she had never done in 12 years on the bench. She filed a motion for compassionate bail on behalf of a defendant she had almost sentenced the day before. She cited Lily's medical condition, Arthur's sole carer status, and the emerging evidence of coercive conduct by a third party. She filed it before 8 in the morning, from her chambers, with the focused efficiency of a woman who had made a decision and was moving fast before she could reconsider it. The motion was granted by 9. Gabe Torres received the news and stared at his phone for almost a full minute before calling Arthur. 2 days later, Victoria drove herself, not her driver, herself, in her own car, a black Audi that she drove with the same precision she brought to everything, to the address Arthur had given her. She had expected poverty, and she found something more particular than that. She found the specific poverty of a person who was managing, just barely, with tremendous and careful effort. The apartment building on Hadley Street was old but not dirty. The hallway smelled of someone's cooking and someone else's laundry, and the carpet on the stairs was thin but swept clean. Arthur's door, second floor on the right, had a child's drawing taped to it, a lopsided house, a yellow sun, and 2 figures labeled in a child's careful printing, Dad and me. She stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the drawing. Then she knocked. Arthur answered the door in a gray sweater and jeans, and he looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been tired for a long time and have stopped noticing it. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise, exactly, but a recalibration. He had seen her twice, in the courtroom, where she had been armored and elevated, and in her chambers, where she had been stripped and raw. This was a third version, apparently, and he was adjusting. She's here, Arthur said. She's been looking forward to meeting you. He paused. I told her you're a friend. Victoria nodded. She stepped inside. The apartment was small. Every surface told a story. Lily's drawings were everywhere, covering the refrigerator, the wall beside the window, the edge of the bathroom door. Books were stacked on every available surface, some of them clearly Lily's, bright spines, illustrated covers, and some of them Arthur's, thick, analytical, the kind with charts and footnotes. On the kitchen counter was a pot of what smelled like chicken soup, and beside it a small collection of prescription bottles, arranged in a careful row. Lily was on the sofa, propped against a pile of pillows, wearing pajamas printed with cartoon foxes. She had a book open on her lap, and she was watching Victoria with an expression of bright, unguarded curiosity. Victoria had been in courtrooms. She had been in boardrooms and ballrooms and legislative chambers. She had faced down defense attorneys, appellate judges, and her own family at their most intimidating. She had never, in her adult life, been rendered uncertain by a child. But those eyes, Chloe's eyes, the same sea glass green, the same gold flecks, looking up at her from a 7-year-old face that had Chloe's fine-boned structure and Arthur's slightly more serious brow. And the combination was so wholly itself, so wholly Lily, and yet so achingly familiar that Victoria felt, for a moment, the room tilt slightly around her. You're Victoria, Lily said. Dad said you're smart. Did he? Victoria said. He said you're the smartest person he's ever argued with. Lily tilted her head. Are you good at chess? I've been known to play. I'm learning, Lily said. I'm not very good yet. But Dad says if you understand the pattern, you can always figure out the next move. She paused. Dad says you understand patterns. Victoria looked at Arthur, who was watching this exchange with the careful expression of a man standing on the edge of something he can't quite see the bottom of. May I sit down? Victoria asked. Lily scooted sideways on the sofa, making room. Victoria sat, and the sofa was slightly too soft, and she would normally have chosen the chair, but she sat on the sofa because Lily had moved for her, and that seemed like the thing to honor. They talked for almost 2 hours. Lily showed her 3 chapters of the fantasy novel she was reading, explaining the plot with the focused intensity of a child who has read something so good that she needs to tell someone about it immediately. She showed Victoria her drawings. The most recent one was a detailed architectural rendering of a tree house, complete with labeled rooms and a pulley system for sending food up from the kitchen. She explained, without self-pity, that she hadn't been able to go to school for most of the year, but that her teacher sent lessons home, and that she liked mathematics best, and she showed Victoria the notebook where she worked through problems. Victoria looked at the notebook for a long time. Chloe had been like this. Patient, precise, interested in everything. Chloe, at 7, had built an elaborate model of the solar system out of paint and papier-mâché and hung it from the ceiling of her bedroom, and had taken Victoria on a guided tour, explaining each planet with the solemnity of a museum docent. Are you okay? Lily asked. Victoria realized she had been very quiet for a moment too long. Yes, she said. I was just thinking about someone I used to know. Lily considered this with the seriousness of a child who takes people's feelings as a matter of genuine interest. Someone good? She asked. Very good, Victoria said. The best person I knew. Lily nodded, as though this was sufficient. She turned back to her notebook. Victoria sat on the soft sofa in the small apartment on Hadley Street, listening to the scratch of Lily's pencil and the distant sound of traffic from outside, and something moved in her chest, something old and calcified and carefully kept still, and she did not try to stop it. Victoria Sterling's legal instincts had been sharpened over 20 years to a degree that occasionally alarmed people around her. She thought in evidence. She noticed gaps in testimony the way a doctor notices an irregular heartbeat, as an automatic function of trained attention. She couldn't turn it off. She sometimes found this annoying. Today, she was grateful for it. She had been back in her chambers for 6 hours when the documents Arthur had provided, a meticulously organized folder of emails, financial records, and transaction logs from his time at Vance Capital, had begun to tell her a story that made her jaw tighten. What Richard Vance had done to Arthur was not, she recognized immediately, an isolated act. It was a pattern. The fund rerouting that Arthur had been coerced into executing was one thread in a much larger tapestry of financial manipulation. Money moved quietly, in amounts calibrated to avoid automatic scrutiny, through a series of shell accounts that connected Vance Capital to at least 3 other firms. She cross-referenced the dates. She cross-referenced the accounts. She called her contact at the Financial Crimes Division at 10:30 in the evening, and he answered in the sleep-roughened voice of a man who knew, from experience, that when Victoria Sterling called past 10 it meant something. I need a consultation, she said. Tomorrow morning. Early. How early? 7. He sighed. I'll make coffee. The next afternoon, she called Arthur. He came to her chambers alone. Gabe had offered to accompany him, and Arthur had said, gently but firmly, that he thought this was a private conversation. He sat across from Victoria's desk and waited while she organized her notes. Tell me about the accounts, she said. Specifically, the routing structure. You're a financial analyst. You saw the actual framework, not just the instructions you were given. What was the architecture? Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You've looked at the documents. I've looked at the documents. He leaned forward. Something changed in him. A shift in register, like a person remembering who they used to be before circumstances stripped that away. The exhausted, cornered man she had seen in her courtroom was still there, but underneath him was someone else, someone with a quick, structural intelligence and a very clear internal map of something complex and deliberately obscured. He talked for 40 minutes. He laid out, from memory, the precise architecture of Richard Vance's financial manipulation, the shell companies, the timing of transactions, the way certain legitimate trades had been used to obscure illegitimate ones, the network of intermediary accounts that allowed money to move without a direct traceable link to Vance himself. He spoke with the precise, fluent confidence of someone describing a structure he had understood completely and had been too afraid, until now, to articulate out loud. Victoria listened, and took notes, and did not interrupt. When he finished, she put down her pen and looked at him directly. "Why didn't you report him?" she asked. "Before this happened." "Lily," Arthur said simply. He knew exactly how much she meant to me. He made it very clear that my cooperation was the price of her safety. Not just the grant, but the threat of what he could do to complicate her care. Delays in treatment approvals. Referrals that didn't come through. He had connections in medical administration. I didn't know how far his reach went. He paused. I thought if I just did what he asked, quietly, it would end. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a man protecting his child, Victoria said. She did not say it gently. She said it the way she stated facts, directly, without ornamentation, leaving it to stand on its own. It also sounds like a man who has significantly more information about Richard Vance's financial conduct than the investigation currently possesses. Arthur looked at her. "I want to be very precise about this," Victoria said. "I cannot, in my judicial capacity, directly participate in a financial crimes investigation. What I can do is ensure that the right people speak to you at the right time, and that any information you provide is received and evaluated appropriately." She paused. "I can also ensure that your cooperation is noted by the relevant parties in terms of your own sentencing." "That's not why I'm telling you this," Arthur said. "I know," Victoria said. "That's exactly why I'm telling you that it matters anyway." She looked at him steadily. "He took advantage of you when you were at your most vulnerable. He used your love for your daughter as a weapon, and he is currently sitting in his office, convinced that this is over." A precise, cold pause. "It isn't over." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "Then, what do you need from me?" Victoria looked at her notes. "Everything," she said. "Every number, every account, every name. We're going to build this correctly, and when it's done, it will hold." She looked up. "Can you do that?" Arthur thought about Richard Vance's smile in the courtroom gallery. He thought about Lily in her hospital bed, watching the broken pigeon. "Yes," he said. The Sterling family estate was called Aldermore, and it sat 12 miles outside Millhaven on a rise of land above the river, behind a stone wall and iron gates, and a long gravel drive lined with oak trees that were, in October, a tunnel of orange and gold. Victoria had not suggested that Arthur and Lily come to stay. She had announced it, in the particular way that she announced things, as a statement of what was going to happen, and then waited for Arthur's objection. He had given her one. "We're fine where we are," she had said. "Lily needs a consistent medical team, not emergency admissions. I have a guest suite. I have 3 physician contacts who will see her weekly at my home. I have a library with an excellent chess set." A pause. "She'll also be safer there. Richard Vance knows where your apartment is." Arthur had been quiet for a long time after that last sentence. They moved to Aldermore the following weekend. Lily's reaction to the house was to stand in the entrance hall. Marble floors, sweeping staircase, a chandelier above her that scattered morning light across the walls, and tilt her head back and say, in a perfectly conversational tone, "This is very big." "It is," Victoria agreed. "Are there secret passages?" Victoria blinked. "Not that I'm aware of." Lily looked disappointed. "Old houses usually have them." She turned and fixed Victoria with a speculative look. "Have you checked all the walls?" A pause. "I have not checked all the walls," Victoria admitted. "We should," Lily said seriously. "Later, after I've seen the library." The library became Lily's favorite room almost immediately. It was a 2-story room off the east wing, with a gallery walkway at the upper level, and the chess set that Victoria had mentioned was inlaid marble, pieces carved from obsidian and alabaster, sitting on a table by the window. Lily spent the first morning investigating every shelf, occasionally pulling down books to examine their spines with the focused attention of a small, methodical librarian. Victoria watched this from the doorway with an expression that Arthur, passing in the corridor, noticed but did not comment on. The arrangement was awkward, sometimes. Victoria was accustomed to an orderly, solitary existence, and the house filled with sounds it hadn't contained in years. The particular sound of a child's footsteps running, the unexpected bright shock of Lily's laughter when Arthur told terrible jokes at dinner, the low conversation from the kitchen where Arthur, who turned out to be a genuinely accomplished cook, had quietly taken over responsibility for evening meals. "You don't have to do that," Victoria told him, the second evening, finding him at the stove. I know, Arthur said. He handed her a glass of wine without being asked. But cooking is the thing I do to stop thinking. And I need to stop thinking. He looked at her sideways. Do you cook? I can make toast, Victoria said. After a pause that was itself its own answer. Then you're in charge of toast, Arthur said. It's important. Don't underestimate it. She had not expected this, the lightness. She had expected and prepared herself for the weight of guilt and grief and the enormous, structural effort of integrating two people into her life. She had not prepared for Arthur's quiet, careful kindness, which did not ask anything of her in return and did not draw attention to itself. He simply treated her like a person he was getting to know, and he was good at it. And she found, after a few days, that she had started looking forward to dinner in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything domestic in a very long time. Lily, for her part, had installed herself in Victoria's life with the casual, confident authority of a small person who has decided that you are trustworthy and sees no reason to be tentative about it. She brought Victoria books she thought she should read. She gave her detailed progress reports on the chess set's pieces. She had named them all. She sat beside Victoria on the library sofa some evenings and leaned comfortably against her arm, reading, and Victoria sat very still the first time this happened. And then, slowly, with the careful precision she brought to unfamiliar things, put her arm around the small, warm, sea-glass-eyed person leaning against her. She had missed so much. That was the thought that came in the quiet moments, unbidden and honest. She had missed Chloe's marriage and Chloe's happiness and Chloe's child, and none of it could be recovered, and the grief for that was its own sharp thing. But she was here now. She was here, and Lily was here, and that was the only available direction, forward. It began, as most meaningful investigations begin, with patience. Arthur set up a workspace in the study, a smaller room off the library, lined with white bards that Victoria had sourced from somewhere without being asked. And he began to reconstruct the full architecture of Vance Capital's financial misconduct from memory, cross-referencing against the documents he had preserved and the public filings that were available. He worked methodically, building a visual map of the transactions, the routes, the timing, the shell companies, the accounts. Victoria came in on the third day, looked at what covered the white bards, and said, "You did this from memory." "Mostly," Arthur said. "I have the habit of memorizing structures. It's the analyst's disease." He paused. "I also knew, when Richard made his move, that I should keep a record, even if I couldn't act on it at the time." He tapped a section of the board. "This is where it gets interesting. Look at the timing of these transactions relative to the market movements on these dates." Victoria looked. She looked for a long time. "He was front-running," she said. "He was front-running," Arthur confirmed. "The fund rerouting I was asked to handle wasn't just about obscuring one set of transactions. It was part of a broader pattern of using client money to preposition ahead of trades that his connected accounts were about to execute. It's elegant, in a terrible way. Each individual piece looks almost legitimate. You need to see the full pattern to understand what it is. And you see the full pattern. I've seen it for 2 years, Arthur said quietly. I just couldn't afford to do anything about it. They worked together with a complementary efficiency that neither of them had initially anticipated. Arthur understood the financial mechanics with an expert's depth. Victoria understood the legal frameworks and the investigative procedures with equal depth, and she knew precisely which elements of Arthur's reconstruction constituted actionable evidence and which required additional corroboration. She was meticulous and demanding and occasionally sharp about the distinction, and Arthur received this without defensiveness, adapting and refining, and she found his capacity for rigorous self-correction genuinely impressive. By the end of the second week, they had shared everything with Patrick Rourke, Victoria's contact at the Financial Crimes Division, and his initial skepticism had given way to a sustained, focused attention that told Victoria he was seeing what they were seeing. By the end of the third week, Rourke's team had independently corroborated 3 of the key transaction chains using records from Vance Capital's auditing firm. The case was building. In the evenings, over dinners that Arthur cooked and that Victoria had come to think of as the best part of her day, a realization she held at arm's length and declined to examine too closely. They talked about Chloe. They shared her, cautiously at first, then more freely. Arthur providing the texture of who she had become, the adult woman in full, and Victoria offering the girl she had been, the younger sister with the big laugh and the solar system on her ceiling, and the brave, reckless courage that had taken her out of one life and into another. "She talked about you once," Arthur said, one evening. "Just once." She said, "I had a sister. I hope she's all right." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "She knew I'd be all right," she said finally. "I was always all right. That was the problem with me." She looked at her glass. Chloe was the one who felt things fully. I admired it and found it overwhelming and didn't know what to do with it. She was better at being alive than I was. "She'd disagree with that," Arthur said. He said it simply, as a statement of fact. "She'd say you just had a different style of being alive. She'd say someone has to hold the structure together so that other people can feel things freely. She'd say that was you." He paused. "She loved you. She didn't talk about you much, but when she did, the way she said my sister, I could hear it." Victoria did not respond for a long moment. When she did, her voice was its usual steadiness, but quietly. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. The party was held at Vance Capital's rooftop venue on the 42nd floor of the Aldine building, a celebration of the firm's annual returns, attended by clients, partners, and the carefully cultivated circle of business contacts that Richard Vance had spent his career assembling. The catering was excellent. The view of Millhaven at night was spectacular, and Richard moved through his guests with the comfortable authority of a man at the exact center of his world. He had, over the preceding weeks, received the news of Arthur's bail with mild irritation, an unexpected administrative development, probably related to the sick child, nothing more. His attorney had confirmed that the evidence against Arthur was solid and the sentencing was merely delayed, not derailed. He had thought about it for approximately the length of time it took to pour a glass of scotch, and then set it aside. He had not thought about Victoria Sterling's involvement. The press had not reported it. No one had told him. This was, as it turned out, a significant oversight. The elevator opened at 11:15, and the first person through it was Patrick Rourke, accompanied by 4 officers from the Financial Crimes Division. The second was Arthur Pendleton, carrying a briefcase. The third was Victoria Sterling. She was wearing black, and she was absolutely, precisely herself, still, contained, purposeful, with no sign in her bearing that this was anything other than a routine professional matter. Except for her eyes, which found Richard Vance across the room with the clarity of a lighthouse beam, and settled on him with an expression that made his glass stop halfway to his mouth. The room noticed, the way rooms notice disruption, and sound fell away in spreading rings from where the group had entered. "Richard Vance," Patrick Rourke said, in the pleasant, level tone of a man who has performed this precise action many times. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of securities fraud, financial misconduct, unauthorized use of client funds, and coercive manipulation of an employee for the purpose of concealing financial crimes." Richard Vance had been in difficult rooms before. He was a man of considerable experience, and he had contingency plans, and his attorney was 3 feet away. He opened his mouth to speak, to deflect, to assert, to do the thing that men in his position did when confronted with inconvenience. Arthur opened the briefcase. The documents inside, printed, organized, labeled with the meticulous precision of someone who had spent 2 years understanding every detail and 2 weeks making sure it was unassailable, went to Rourke, who was already handing them to his officers. On the room's central display screen, intended for the evening's financial presentation, a connection request had been accepted from Arthur's laptop, and what now appeared was the transaction map from the study's whiteboard, the full architecture of Vance Capital's misconduct, laid out in visual form, clear and damning and beautiful in its horrible completeness. The room stared at the screen. Richard Vance stared at the screen. Then he looked at Arthur, and Arthur looked back at him, and Arthur's expression was not triumphant. It was something quieter than that. It was the expression of a man who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has just, precisely, set it down. "You built all this," Richard said, and there was something almost like professional admiration in his voice under the shock. "From what you had, I had 2 years," Arthur said, "and a very good reason to remember everything." Richard looked, finally, at Victoria. She returned his gaze without expression. "You should have read the file more carefully," she said. "The defendant's background was in financial analysis. You chose the wrong person to use." Richard's attorney was moving, already talking, and Rourke's officers were already moving with the smooth efficiency of people who have anticipated every response and prepared for all of them. And Richard Vance, who had stood in the 42nd floor of the Aldine building presiding over his world with absolute certainty, was guided toward the elevator in handcuffs while his guests watched in stunned, cocktail-suspended silence. Arthur stood for a moment in the middle of the room after. He felt nothing complicated. He felt, very simply, that a thing which had needed doing had been done. Victoria appeared beside him. She did not touch him or say anything congratulatory. That was not her way. She simply stood beside him for a moment, and then Lily sent a message. She says, and I'm quoting directly, "Tell Dad the broken pigeon was outside the window again today, and it definitely still flies." Arthur laughed. It came out of nowhere, a full, genuine laugh, and several people around him turned to look, startled by the sound of it in the charged, stunned air of the room. "She'd been waiting to deliver that," he said. "Apparently," Victoria said, and the corner of her mouth, just barely, just briefly, moved. The cemetery was on the edge of Millhaven, where the city thinned out into the kind of quiet residential neighborhood that still had old trees and unhurried streets. Chloe's grave was under a silver birch that had gone entirely yellow in the November cold, its leaves falling in a slow, steady drift that accumulated in small drifts against the headstone. Chloe Pendleton, née Sterling, beloved wife and mother. She made the world warmer. Arthur had chosen the inscription himself. He had stood in the funeral director's office for a long time, trying to find the words that were true without being either too small or too large, and those were the ones that had come to him. Simple and exact. She had made the world warmer. That was what she had done. The three of them came on a Saturday afternoon in November. Lily had brought flowers, not from a florist but from a gas station near the apartment, because she had wanted to choose them herself, and the gas station flowers were bright and cheerful and slightly impractical, with a large orange dahlia among them that was losing petals. She had insisted on the dahlia specifically. "Mom would like the silly one," she said, with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who knows things. Victoria stood slightly apart from Arthur and Lily, at first. She stood the way she stood everywhere, with composure, with her hands still at her sides, but it was a different quality of stillness than usual. Less controlled, more exposed. Arthur stood with Lily for a few minutes, and Lily talked to the headstone with the easy naturalness of a child who has grown up treating this as normal. She reported on the chess set at Aldermore, and the library, and the broken pigeon, and a book she had finished that she thought Mom would have liked. She said that she had a friend now. She paused and looked at Victoria, and then turned back to the headstone. "A sort of aunt," she said. "A real one." Then she took Arthur's hand, and she pulled him back toward the path, because she had spotted a squirrel and required closer investigation, and there was a moment of particular grace in which Arthur and Lily moved away, and Victoria was left alone at the grave. She stood very still. Then she crouched down, and she put her hand on the cold stone, and she was quiet for a long time. When she rose and came back to where Arthur and Lily were watching the squirrel, her eyes were clear. Not the forced clarity of suppression, but the clearer quality of something set down. "She forgave you," Arthur said. He said it without preamble, because he had been thinking about how to say it for several days, and the direct way was the truest way, and Victoria deserved the truest version. "I know she did." It was the same thing she said about the broken pigeon, in a way. Things break. They still fly. Victoria looked at him. "She left a family," Arthur continued. "She built one from nothing, and she was glad of it, every day that I knew her. She wasn't carrying anger. She wasn't carrying anything except love and Lily and the next chapter of whatever book she was reading." He paused. "I think she wanted you to know that. I think she'd want me to make sure you knew." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked down at Lily, who had abandoned the squirrel and was now holding out the slightly damaged dahlia, offering it up with the serious, ceremonial air of a child conducting an important transaction. "For you," Lily said, "because I think you're sad, and flowers help." Victoria took the dahlia. She held it in both hands with the same care she had given to the photograph in the courtroom, weeks ago, in a different lifetime. "Thank you, Lily," she said. Lily considered her for a moment. Then she took Victoria's hand, quite naturally, the way she took Arthur's hand, as though it were simply what you did when you were standing beside someone in a place that was important. They stood at the grave for another few minutes, the three of them, and the birch tree, and the falling yellow leaves, and then they walked back to the car together. 1 year later, the light came through the dining room windows at Aldermore in the way that November light comes into old houses, low and golden, catching the dust in the air, turning the long table and the mismatched chairs and the entirely too large flower arrangement. Lily had been in charge of the arrangement. Victoria had chosen not to intervene, into something that looked considerably warmer and more inhabited than it had looked in many, many years. There was a roast in the kitchen, and the smell of it had been moving through the house for 2 hours, settling into the curtains and the carpets and the general atmosphere in the way that cooking smells do in houses where they are welcome. Lily set the table. She set it with great ceremony, because everything Lily did was done with great ceremony, and because she had recently made a study of formal table settings from one of Aldermore's reference books and was now applying this knowledge with fierce and slightly overwhelming precision. There were 3 settings at one end of the long table. This was always where they ate. Victoria had long ago conceded the formal length of the table to Lily's judgment, which held that eating close together was better than eating far apart, and this judgment was objectively correct, and each setting was immaculate. Arthur came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder, checked the table, and said, "You put the dessert fork in the wrong place." Lily looked at the fork. She looked at Arthur. "I did it on purpose," she said. "To test you." "Did you?" "You passed," she said, and moved the fork. Arthur smiled. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen and looked at the dining room, at Lily, carefully straightening the last fork with the tip of one finger, at the low golden light, at the flower arrangement that had an inappropriate number of pine cones in it for this time of year, and the fullness of the moment was something he couldn't quite contain. He had learned, in the past year, to let those moments exist without trying to manage them. Chloe would have called that growth. Victoria came in from the study at 6:15, still in her work suit from a morning appearance before an appellate panel, though she had removed the jacket. In the past year, Arthur had noticed that her courtroom persona and her Aldermore persona had gradually converged into something that was unmistakably her, but slightly less armored, as though the careful work of allowing herself to be known had produced, over time, a version of Victoria Sterling that was both recognizably formidable and genuinely, quietly warm. It had happened slowly and without announcement. Like most real things, it had just accumulated. "How did the Harmon case go?" Arthur asked. "Well," Victoria said. "The defense's argument was creative but ultimately unsound. I enjoyed the creative part." She looked at the table. "Lily, did you build that centerpiece?" "Yes," Lily said. "Do you like it?" Victoria looked at the pine cones. "It's distinctive," she said, and took her seat. They ate. The conversation ranged widely, in the way that dinners went when one person had spent the day in court, one person had spent the day at the analytics firm where he was now a senior partner, a position he had assumed 3 months after Richard Vance's arrest, when the firm's new management had headhunted him with the frank admission that Arthur had a level of financial pattern recognition that was simply unusual, and one person had spent the day learning fractions and writing a story and conducting a search for the secret passages she remained convinced were somewhere in Aldermore's East Wing. "I found a door," Lily announced at dessert. Arthur looked up. "In the East Wing," Lily said. "Behind the bookshelf in the blue room. A real door, with a handle." Victoria set down her fork. She looked at Lily. Then, slowly, a full, genuine smile. The kind she had been practicing, Arthur thought, for several months now, with the same methodical dedication she brought to everything. "That's the old butler's passage," she said. "It connects to the kitchen." Lily's eyes went wide. "I was right," she said. "You were right," Victoria confirmed. Lily turned to Arthur with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific vindication and is now receiving it in full. "Dad, I was right about the secret passages." "You were right about the secret passages," Arthur agreed. Lily looked at Victoria. "Thank you for having a house with secret passages." "You're welcome," Victoria said. "I'll note that I had them before you arrived." "But I found them," Lily said. "That counts." "That counts," Victoria agreed. Later, after dinner, after Lily had fallen asleep in the library, on the sofa, under a blanket, the chest set in view, a book open across her chest, Arthur and Victoria sat in the garden room with coffee, and the night was cold outside the windows, and the grounds of Aldermore were dark and quiet under a clear November sky. She had her 6-month check last week, Arthur said. Dr. Chin's team had declared Lily's heliogen therapy a complete success in June. Her bone marrow was producing healthy cells and had been doing so for 5 months without interruption. The 6-month check was a milestone. The transition from treatment to observation, from fighting to simply watching and waiting and expecting continued health. I know, Victoria said. Dr. Chin called me. Arthur looked at her. She thought I'd want to know, Victoria said, a little defensively. She was right, Arthur said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. You know, when I walked into that courtroom last year, I thought, that's it. That's the end. I was going to prison. Lily was going to a care facility while I was gone. Richard had one. And that was the end of the story. He paused. I didn't think there was a way out. There usually is, Victoria said. It's just that the way out isn't the one you can see from where you're standing. Arthur considered this. Is that legal wisdom? It's something Chloe once said to me, Victoria said, in a letter she never sent. I found it in her room, after she left. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She wrote it when she was trying to explain why she was leaving. She said, I can't see the way out from here. But I know there is one, because there always is, if you're willing to move. I kept it. I had it for 10 years, and I didn't understand what she meant, and then she stopped. And then, Arthur said, and then a photograph fell on my courtroom floor, Victoria said, and I understood. They sat in companionable quiet for a while. Two people who had found each other through grief and circumstance and the particular, improbable mechanics of a dropped wallet, and who had built from those materials something that had no precise name but felt, in its texture and its warmth and its daily, ordinary rightness, exactly like family. Outside, through the glass, a thin November moon was rising over the oak trees on the drive, and the leaves were long gone from them now, and the bare branches made a pattern against the sky that was, in its way, beautiful. Not the beauty of fullness, but the beauty of a structure made clear, the essential architecture of a thing with all its ornament removed. In the library, Lily slept. The chess set waited on its table. The books rose to the gallery above, and above the books the old house settled into its bones with the contented sounds of a place that had remembered what it was for. She had a sister once, Chloe had said. The sister was all right. More than all right. The broken pigeon still flew.